The morning my family found out I was engaged to Daniel Osei, my mother dropped her favorite ceramic teapot. It didn't just slip. It shattered, the kind of explosive, deliberate-sounding crash that only happens when a hand loses its grip because the mind has gone somewhere else entirely. The pieces scattered across the kitchen tiles like a map of something broken that could never be reassembled the same way twice. She didn't move to pick them up. She just stood there, staring at the photo I'd placed on the counter, Daniel and me, laughing at the harbor, his arm around my shoulder like it belonged there. My name is Vivian Alcott. I was 31 years old, the middle daughter of a family that had built its identity around one thing above everything else: appearances. The Alcotts were not rich by the standards of the people they pretended to associate with, but they were extraordinarily skilled at performing wealth. My father, Reginald, had spent 23 years in commercial real estate, wearing suits that were slightly too expensive for his income bracket and driving a car that was perpetually 2 months behind on its lease. My mother, Constance, chaired every neighborhood committee she could find, organized charity galas for organizations she barely understood, and kept a social calendar so tightly managed it might as well have been a military operation. And then there was me, the daughter who had always quietly, persistently refused to follow the script. I had met Daniel Osei 14 months before that morning in the kitchen. I'd been at a community legal aid clinic, doing pro bono work as I did every third Saturday. He had walked in wearing a construction-worn jacket, carrying a manila folder stuffed with papers, trying to navigate a property dispute that had been eating his family's savings for 2 years. He wasn't a client, he was volunteering, same as me, helping translate documents for an elderly Ghanaian couple who'd been targeted by a predatory loan scheme. What struck me first wasn't his looks, though the looks were certainly worth noting. It was the way he listened. Most people listened to respond. Daniel listened to understand. He sat with that elderly couple for 3 hours, never once checking his phone, never once letting impatience flicker across his face. When the old man began to cry about losing the home he'd spent 40 years building, Daniel put his hand over the man's and said, quietly, "We're going to fix this. Not I'll try. Not, we'll see what we can do. Just, we're going to fix this." I think I fell in love with him somewhere in that sentence. By the time I placed that photo on my mother's kitchen counter, Daniel and I had been inseparable for over a year. He ran a mid-sized construction company. Honest work, solid work. And he had a laugh that started somewhere deep in his chest and arrived at his face a full second later, like it had traveled a long distance to get there. He was thoughtful and stubborn and occasionally maddening, and he was the first person I had ever met who made me feel like I didn't need to perform anything. My mother finally looked up from the shattered teapot. "Vivian," she said, "tell me this is a joke." My father came in from the hallway, drawn by the crash. He looked at the photo. He looked at me. Something passed across his face, not quite disgust, but its better-dressed cousin. "He's a construction worker," my father said. "He owns a construction company," I said. "There's a difference?" There it was. 23 years of carefully maintained illusion, distilled into 4 words delivered with the kind of casual precision that only comes from long practice. I had known this moment was coming. I had rehearsed my responses, steeled myself against exactly this flavor of disappointment. And still, something in me flinched. What I didn't say, what I couldn't yet bring myself to say, was that Daniel Osei wasn't just a construction company owner. That the manila folder he'd been carrying the day we met was connected to something much larger than a property dispute. That the quiet, careful man my family was dismissing so effortlessly had been building something for years. Something that was about to become relevant to the Alcott family in ways none of us could yet imagine. But that part of the story hadn't arrived yet. My sister Eloise called that evening. She was 3 years older than me, recently divorced, and had taken our parents' gift for social performance and weaponized it into a career in event planning. She had an opinion about everything and delivered each one with the confidence of someone who had never once considered being wrong. "I heard," she said, skipping hello. "Mom is devastated. Mom will survive. Vivian, be serious. Do you know what people will say?" "Which people?" She went quiet for a moment, recalibrating. "You have always done this," she said finally. "You have always deliberately chosen the most difficult path, just to prove a point. This isn't rebellion anymore. This is your life." "I know it's my life," I said. "That's exactly why I'm living it." I hung up before she could respond. I sat in my apartment for a long time after that, looking at the ring on my finger, simple, white gold, a small oval diamond, and thinking about the version of this story where I cared more about what my family thought. Where I made the easier choice. Where I spent my life in a performance of someone else's idea of success. Then I thought about Daniel's hand over that old man's, and the certainty in his voice. We're going to fix this. 3 weeks later, I married him in a small ceremony with 14 guests. My parents came, but they sat in the back row with expressions that suggested they were attending something between a disappointment and a funeral. Eloise did not come at all. What none of us knew, not my parents, not Eloise, not even me, was that within 18 months, everything the Alcott family had spent decades constructing would begin to collapse. And the only thing standing between them and total ruin would be the man they'd dismissed as the wrong choice. But before that could happen, something had to break first. And it was already breaking, though none of us could hear it yet. The cracks in the Alcott family's carefully polished surface had been forming long before my wedding day. I just hadn't been paying close enough attention. Looking back, the signs were everywhere. In the way my father stopped talking about his deals the way he used to, with that expansive, theatrical enthusiasm that filled whatever room he was in. In the way my mother began hosting fewer dinner parties, citing scheduling conflicts that didn't quite add up. In the brief, heavy silences that fell between my parents in rooms they thought I wasn't watching. I was paying attention to my own life. Daniel and I had settled into marriage with the easy comfort of two people who had already decided who they were before they found each other. We lived in a converted warehouse apartment on the east side of the city, the kind of neighborhood my mother referred to as up and coming, which was her way of saying not quite acceptable yet. The apartment had high ceilings and original brick and a kitchen that Daniel had partially rebuilt himself on a long weekend, adding shelving and lighting and cabinet handles that he'd sourced from a reclamation yard. My family visited exactly once. My mother spent most of the visit looking at the exposed pipes in the ceiling with an expression that suggested they personally offended her. It was in the 7th month of our marriage that Daniel first mentioned a name I would come to know intimately. Harmon Properties. We were eating dinner, pasta, a recipe his mother had sent in a handwritten letter from Accra, and he was going through his work email on his phone, which I normally would have teased him about. But something in the set of his jaw stopped me. "What is it?" I asked. He looked up. There was a pause, the kind where someone is deciding how much to say. "There's a development project," he said carefully. "Commercial corridor, about 12 blocks of it. Someone's been systematically buying up the properties. Quietly. That happens all the time. Not like this." He put his phone down. "3 of the property owners have already told me they felt pressured. One of them says the representative who contacted her made it clear that if she didn't sell voluntarily, she'd find herself buried in code violations." I set my fork down. "That's illegal. It's very illegal. It's also very hard to prove." He looked at me steadily. "I've been collecting information on Harmon for about 8 months. They've done this before, different city, different corridor, same pattern." I studied his face. There was something behind his eyes that I recognized, the same focused, unhurried determination I'd seen in that legal aid clinic, when he'd promised an old man he was going to fix something. "How involved are you in this?" "I have some of the affected property owners as clients," he said. "My company is contracted to do work on several of the buildings they're trying to acquire." "So you're in the middle of it." "I've been in the middle of it for a while." He picked his fork up again, but he wasn't eating. "I just didn't want to worry you." I stored that conversation away. Not because I was worried, not yet, but because I recognized it as significant. Daniel didn't raise alarms. If he was naming something at the dinner table, it was because it had already grown past the point where he could manage it quietly. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't know for another 3 weeks, was that Harmon Properties had a local partner. And that partner's name would stop my heart when I finally heard it. My father called me on a Tuesday in October, which was unusual. Reginald Alcott was not a phone caller. He communicated in formal emails, occasional stiff-armed hugs, and the language of advice delivered as instruction. A phone call in the middle of the day meant something had shifted. "I need to speak with you," he said. "In person." We met at a restaurant he chose, neutral territory, which told me he'd thought about this. And he arrived before me, which meant he'd been nervous enough to be early. My father was never early. He considered it a form of social vulnerability. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him. Not dramatically, just a degree of wear around his eyes that hadn't been there before, a tension in his shoulders that his posture couldn't quite conceal. He ordered water. He waited until the server left. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear it without judgment." That sentence alone told me everything I needed to know about the magnitude of what was coming. My father had never once in his life asked me to hear anything without judgment. He didn't believe in suspended judgment. He was a man of immediate, confident assessments. "I've made some investments," he said carefully, "that haven't gone the way I planned." The story came out in pieces, the way these stories always do when someone has been carrying them alone for too long. Over the past 4 years, Reginald Alcott had made a series of increasingly desperate real estate investments, trying to recover from an initial loss that he'd never told my mother about. He'd borrowed against their home. He'd leveraged properties. He'd taken money from a private investment group with terms that he now admitted he hadn't fully understood when he'd signed. That investment group was called Harmon Properties. The air in the restaurant changed. Or maybe it was just the blood draining from my face. "Dad," I said slowly. "How much?" The number he gave me was not a number. It was a sentence. A long one without a good ending. I drove home in a kind of suspended silence, the city moving past my windows like a film I wasn't following. I kept thinking about Daniel at the dinner table, saying the name Harmon Properties with that particular careful weight in his voice. I kept thinking about the 8 months he'd spent collecting information on a company that had apparently been quietly dismantling my father's financial life from the inside. When I got home, Daniel was in the kitchen. He looked at my face and stopped what he was doing. "What happened?" he asked. I sat down at the table. I pressed my hands flat against the surface. "Harmon Properties," I said. "My father is involved with Harmon Properties." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something, some complicated mixture of calculation and concern that moved across Daniel's face before he got it under control. "How involved?" he asked. "Deeply," I said. He sat down across from me. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, and I would think about this sentence for months afterward, "Tell me everything he told you. Start from the beginning." But what he said next, what he admitted he already knew about Harmon, about their operations, about what was coming, made everything my father had told me sound like only the beginning of a much larger catastrophe. There are moments in a marriage when you realize you have married someone larger than you understood them to be. Not in an alarming way. Not the discovery of a hidden life or a secret self. But the gradual, sometimes startling revelation that the person across the table from you has been carrying dimensions of themselves quietly, without performance, waiting for the moment when those dimensions would be needed. That October night was one of those moments. Daniel spread 3 manila folders across our kitchen table. Not the battered one from the legal aid clinic. These were newer, thicker, organized with the methodical precision of someone who had been building a case. Because that, I would come to understand, was exactly what he had been doing. "Harmon Properties is not a real estate company," he said. "Or rather, it is a real estate company, but that's not its primary function." He walked me through it with the patient clarity of someone who had rehearsed this explanation many times in his own head, and was finally, reluctantly, giving it to someone else. Harmon operated as a front for a capital extraction scheme. A sophisticated one. The kind that attracted lawyers and accountants and financial architects who were very good at making things look legal from the outside. They identified targets, property owners who were already financially stretched, investors who were desperate enough to take terms without reading them carefully, communities where assets could be acquired below market value through applied pressure. They had done this in 2 other cities. In both cases, by the time anyone understood the full scope of what had happened, the extraction was complete. The principles were unreachable. The money was gone. "How long have you known this?" I asked. "Known it the way I know it now. About 4 months. He paused. "Suspected it?" "Since the day I walked into that legal aid clinic." I stared at him. The couple I was helping that day, the Mensahs, the ones with the loan dispute, Harmon was behind their situation too. I didn't know it then. But when I started looking into their case more seriously, the trail kept leading back to the same company. "Daniel." I pressed my fingers against my temples. "You've been investigating them." "Not officially. I'm not law enforcement. But I've been gathering documentation, communication records, contract copies, testimony from affected property owners. I've been in contact with a federal investigator for the past 6 weeks." The room felt like it was recalibrating around me. "Why didn't you tell me?" He looked at me carefully. Not defensively, carefully. "Because I was hoping your family wasn't involved. When you mentioned your father worked in commercial real estate, I looked. At the time, nothing connected. I kept looking." He paused. "The connection surfaced 3 weeks ago." 3 weeks. I was trying to understand the full scope of his exposure before I said anything. I didn't want to alarm you with incomplete information. I sat with that for a moment. I understood the logic. I even respected it. But something else was shifting underneath my understanding, a colder question forming. How bad is his exposure? Daniel opened the second folder. What I saw over the next 40 minutes was not just my father's financial crisis. It was the anatomy of a disaster years in the making, a cascade of compounding decisions, each one reasonable in isolation, collectively catastrophic. Reginald Alcott had not simply borrowed from Harmon. He had, in the structure of their investment agreement, inadvertently become a nominal signatory on several of their property acquisition deals. He almost certainly hadn't understood what he was signing. That wouldn't protect him. They use this structure deliberately, Daniel said. If the scheme collapses, the small investors and signatories become the visible face of the liability. The principals walk away. The people who got caught up in it take the fall. My father could be held liable for things he had no idea he was part of. Yes. Can we stop it? Daniel was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. That depends on how quickly we move and what your father is willing to do. My father. The man who had sat in the back row of my wedding with a face like a closed door. The man who had never once asked me to hear anything without judgment, until now. The man who had looked at my husband and seen the wrong choice. He'll need to cooperate, Daniel said. Fully. And he'll need to trust me. I laughed, a short, involuntary sound without any humor in it. He doesn't trust you, I said. He barely acknowledges your existence. Daniel looked at me with those steady eyes of his. I know, he said. That's why you're going to have to be the one to bring him in. What I didn't understand yet, what no one in my family understood, was that the situation was more urgent than even Daniel's careful, thorough folders had captured. Because Harmon Properties was not waiting. I called my father the next morning. I kept my voice level. I told him I needed to see him and that he should bring every document connected to his Harmon investments. Every contract. Every correspondence. Every wire transfer record. He resisted initially. My father's default response to vulnerability was to refuse witnesses. I have a handle on it, he said. Dad. Please trust me. A long pause. This is about your husband, isn't it? Just bring the documents. He arrived at our apartment 2 days later with a cardboard box and an expression of controlled discomfort. The look of a man doing something that cost him considerably. He set the box on our kitchen table and looked around our home with what appeared to be his first genuine assessment of it, rather than a comparison to somewhere better. Daniel came in from the other room. They looked at each other. My father extended his hand stiffly. Reginald Alcott, he said. I know, Daniel said and shook it. Sit down. We have a lot to cover. It was the first real conversation my father and my husband had ever had. I sat at the end of the table and watched it unfold. Daniel patient, systematic, never once displaying triumph or condescension. My father gradually, visibly peeling back layers of resistance as the evidence in front of him became impossible to explain away. At one point my father looked up from a document and said quietly, How long have you known about this? Long enough to help, Daniel said. If we move quickly. My father looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted behind his eyes. The kind of shift that happens when a foundation cracks and the building has to redistribute its weight. What do I need to do? He asked. It was only later that night, when my father had left and Daniel was still at the table working through documents, that I realized what I hadn't noticed while it was happening. My father had not once, treated Daniel like a lesser. He had spoken to him as an equal, as someone whose judgment was worth taking seriously. It had taken a catastrophe to produce what common decency should have given freely. But the catastrophe I was about to discover wasn't finished arriving. My mother still didn't know. That was the impossible arithmetic of the next 2 weeks, the urgent, complicated work happening in our apartment, the folders multiplying across our kitchen table, the phone calls Daniel was making to his contact at the Federal Financial Crimes Unit, all of it conducted against the backdrop of my mother's continued, blameless ignorance. Constance Alcott ran her household like a general. She organized and optimized and controlled. But her control had always been social. The management of appearances, relationships, schedules. The financial machinery of the family had been my father's domain entirely, and he had guarded it with the thoroughness of someone who had something to hide. Now he did. She needs to know. I told my father on a Wednesday evening, standing in the parking lot of Daniel's office building where he'd come to review updated documents. I'll tell her, he said. When we have a resolution. There's no point upsetting her before we know. Dad. I stopped. She is going to be far more upset if she finds out you kept this from her. You need to tell her. He looked past me at the street. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was fighting something. She won't understand why I didn't. No, I said. She won't. But she'll understand it even less if she hears it from someone other than you. He told her that Friday. I know because she called me at 11 o'clock that night. And for the first time in my adult life, my mother was crying. Not the elegant, contained emotion I'd seen at weddings and funerals. Real crying, the kind that doesn't care about its own sound. Why didn't he tell me? She kept asking. Why didn't he just tell me? I didn't have an answer that would satisfy her, so I didn't try to give one. I let her cry. I said I was there. I told her we were working on it, that Daniel had people, that there were options. Daniel, she repeated. The name landed differently than it used to. Yes, Mom. Daniel. A long pause. He's really helping? He knows what he's doing. He absolutely knows what he's doing. She was quiet. Then, I was unkind to him. It was the closest my mother had ever come to an apology in my presence. I tucked it away carefully. You can tell him that yourself, I said. When this is over. What neither of us knew, what was only becoming clear to Daniel and his federal contact, was that the timeline we were working against was not months. It was weeks. Maybe less. Harmon was moving. The detail that changed everything arrived in Daniel's email on a Thursday morning. He was already at the table when I woke up. He'd been there since 5, apparently coffee cold beside him, 3 new folders open. They're accelerating the acquisition schedule, he said without looking up. 6 properties they've been slowly pressuring. They're moving to forced sale proceedings next week. I came to look over his shoulder. Can they do that legally? They think they can. They've structured the contracts to include default clauses triggered by missed payments. Payments that were never properly communicated were due. He pointed to a highlighted section of a document. Your father's signature appears on 2 of these acquisition structures. If Harmon pushes through the forced sales, he becomes associated with the coercive transactions as a nominal party. Even though he didn't know? Intent is hard to establish when your name is on the contract. That's the architecture of the scheme. He finally looked up. My federal contact needs a complete documentation package, originals not copies, plus signed affidavits from 3 of the property owners and an insider account from someone with signatory access. My father. He needs to give a formal statement. On record. I sat down. He'll do it. I know he will. Daniel paused. There's something else. I waited. One of the principals behind Harmon, not the one registered publicly, the actual controlling interest, I finally identified them. He turned his laptop toward me. I looked at the screen. I looked at the name. I felt the specific vertiginous sensation of a world reorganizing around a fact you weren't prepared for. The name on the screen was someone my family had known for 11 years. If you're still watching right now, you're exactly the kind of viewer I love. Subscribe so I can keep giving you stories that touch your heart. Hit that bell so you never miss what happens next. Gerald Whitmore had been my father's closest professional friend for over a decade. They had met through the commercial real estate network, the same handshake and golf course circuit that Reginald Alcott had spent his career navigating. Whitmore was everything my father aspired to be. Genuinely wealthy, socially effortless, with a reputation as a dealmaker that had produced enough mythology to survive several scrutinized transactions. He had been at our family Christmas dinners. He had given a toast at my parents' 30th anniversary party. He had called my father Reg since the first week they'd met, with a warmth that my father had clearly found enormously flattering. He had also, systematically and deliberately, been the architect of my father's financial destruction. Daniel walked me through the documentation with the same careful patience he applied to everything. Whitmore had identified my father 3 years ago as a useful asset, someone with enough professional credibility to add legitimacy to Harmon's signatory structures, without enough financial sophistication to recognize what he was being recruited into. The investment opportunities Whitmore had introduced my father to, framed as exclusive access available only to trusted contacts, had been calculated entry points into the scheme. He groomed him, I said. Yes, Daniel said. That's exactly what he did. The rage I felt was clean and cold. Nothing like the messy, complicated anger I usually brought to things. This was simple. A man my father had trusted as a friend had spent years engineering his ruin. Does my father know? I asked. Not yet. I wanted to tell you first. I understood why. My father would need to hear this from me. From family. Not from the son-in-law he'd once dismissed as the wrong choice. I drove to my parents' house the next morning. My mother opened the door, and for the first time in my memory, she hugged me at the threshold without waiting for me to come inside first. It was brief and a little stiff. Constance Alcott had not become a different person overnight, but it was genuine. My father was in his study. He'd always kept it meticulously organized. Degrees on the wall, industry awards on a shelf, everything arranged to project authority. But the desk was different now. Papers in uncharacteristic disarray. A half-empty coffee mug from what looked like yesterday. I sat down and I told him about Whitmore. I watched my father age 10 years in 10 minutes. Not dramatically, his face didn't crumple. He was Reginald Alcott, he didn't crumple. But something structural changed. Something that had been holding itself upright for a very long time quietly stopped trying. Gerald, he said. Just the name. Flat. I'm sorry, Dad. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I'd never heard him say before in any context about anything. I was stupid. You trusted someone. I trusted the wrong person. He looked at his desk. I didn't ask questions because I didn't want to seem unsophisticated. I wanted him to think I understood things I didn't understand. He paused. The same way he stopped. I let the silence sit. The same way I judged Daniel, he said finally. Based on how things looked instead of what they were. I said nothing. It wasn't a moment for language. He's been trying to protect us, my father said. This whole time? Yes. Before he even had a reason to. That's who he is, I said. That's who I married. My father nodded slowly. And then he picked up his phone and called Daniel directly. The first time he had ever dialed that number. I heard Daniel answer. I heard my father say, with a roughness in his voice that was the closest he could get to open feeling. Tell me what you need me to do. I'll do whatever it takes. What neither of them knew, what was only going to become clear in the next 48 hours, was that Whitmore had already discovered that Daniel had been building a case against him. And Gerald Whitmore did not intend to let that case reach anyone. The message arrived on Daniel's phone at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. He didn't show it to me immediately. I noticed something wrong in the morning. The way he'd been awake before me again, the particular quality of his stillness at the breakfast table that meant he was thinking hard about something he wasn't ready to say. What happened? I asked. He showed me his phone. The message was from an unknown number, but the content made the sender unmistakable. It referenced specific details, client names, documentation locations, the name of the federal investigator Daniel had been in contact with. Information that should not have been accessible. Information that suggested someone with resources and reach had been watching Daniel's activities carefully. The message ended with a sentence I read 3 times. Some files have a way of disappearing before they reach their destination. So do some people's careers. Think carefully. I set the phone down on the table. My hands were steady, which surprised me. He knows about the case, I said. He knows about most of it. Daniel's voice was calm, which was different from settled. It was the calm of someone doing active work to stay level. He doesn't know how much has already been transmitted to the federal unit. The core documentation went 2 days ago. So the thread is largely empty in terms of the case, but not entirely without teeth. He looked at me. He has lawyers. Very good ones. If he moves to discredit me professionally, claims my client relationships constitute conflicts of interest, challenges the chain of custody of documents, he can create enough noise to delay the federal process significantly. And in the time that delay creates, he liquidates, restructures through subsidiary entities. The principals walk. I looked at my husband across the breakfast table. This man my family had thought was the wrong choice, and felt something clarify inside me. What do? We accelerate. He picked up his coffee. Your father's affidavit needs to be recorded today, not this week. And I need one more thing. What? Eloise. I blinked. Why Eloise? Because 6 months ago, she organized a charity fundraising gala. Whitmore was a major donor. She was the event coordinator. He paused. According to public donation records, the full amount he pledged was never transferred to the charity. A portion was redirected. I stared at him. He used her event to launder money. Specifically, to launder money in a way that leaves a paper trail appearing to connect the event coordinator. He said it gently, with the careful delivery of someone aware of the weight of what he was transferring. Your sister may not be in legal danger. But she's been placed adjacent to something that could be made to look very bad if Whitmore decides to throw the people around him under the bus to save himself. My sister, who had not come to my wedding. My sister, who had called me to say I was being deliberately difficult by choosing the wrong life. My sister, who did not know that the life she was living had been quietly, efficiently compromised. She doesn't know, I said. I know she doesn't. That's why you need to tell her. The call to Eloise was the hardest thing I'd done in the entire ordeal, and the ordeal had not been easy. Not because she was cold, she wasn't, not this time. It was hard because she was afraid. The carefully managed control my sister brought to every interaction dissolved the moment she understood the scope of what I was telling her, and what emerged underneath it was something raw and young and very human. I didn't know, she kept saying. Vivian, I didn't know. I know you didn't. Why would he? She stopped. Why would he use my event? Because it was clean. You're reputable. Nobody would look closely. I'm going to be sick. Eloise. I kept my voice steady. Daniel can protect you. But he needs documentation from you, all your communication with Whitmore, every financial record from the gala, anything in writing. A long pause. Then, quietly. He can really do that? He's already done it for a lot of people. I was awful to you, she said. At your wedding. About Daniel. I was terrible, Vivian. We can talk about that later. Right now I need you to gather documents. I'll do it today. A pause. Vivian? Tell Daniel, tell him, she stopped. Tell him yourself, I said gently. Soon. What I couldn't tell her, what I was only just learning as we spoke, was that Whitmore had made a second move. One that had nothing to do with documents or lawyers. One that was far more direct. The man who showed up at Daniel's office that afternoon wasn't a lawyer. He was large and unhurried, and he sat in the waiting area for 40 minutes before Daniel's assistant noticed he hadn't stated his business, hadn't asked for anyone specifically, had just positioned himself. When she asked if she could help him, he said he was waiting for a friend and smiled pleasantly. When she asked for a name, he gave one that didn't match any appointment. When she pressed, he stood and left. But not before taking photographs of the office directory displayed in the lobby. Daniel called me from the parking garage, where he'd gone immediately after his assistant described the visitor. His voice was level, but I'd been married to him long enough to hear what lived underneath level. Don't go to your parents' house alone today, he said. My blood went cold. Do you think he'd actually? I don't think he'd directly harm anyone. The risk to him is too high. But I think he wants us to feel watched. Destabilized. I think he wants us making emotional decisions instead of strategic ones. That's not going to work. I know. A brief pause. I've already called my federal contact. The escalation of intimidation is now part of the record. It actually accelerates his timeline to move. If he's willing to deploy someone to photograph my office, he's more nervous than I thought. Daniel. I gripped my phone. How close are we? 36 hours, he said. Maybe less. The core documentation package is already with the investigator. What we need is for your father's formal affidavit to be received and logged before Whitmore can file any preemptive legal motion to challenge Daniel's standing as a source. When is the affidavit recording? This afternoon. 3 o'clock. I'll be there. Vivian. I'll be there, I said again. The recording session happened in a federal building downtown. A beige room with a camera and a court reporter and a quiet intensity that felt nothing like television depictions of these things. My father sat across from an investigator, and I sat against the wall, and Daniel sat beside my father the way a person sits beside someone going into surgery, present, steady, not making it about themselves. Reginald Alcott gave his statement. I had always known my father as a performer, a man who managed his presentation with careful, exhausting deliberateness. What I watched in that beige room was something different. He was not performing. He described the sequence of his decisions with painful, unsparing honesty. Every moment of willful ignorance, every choice to not ask a question he suspected would have an uncomfortable answer. Every time he had prioritized the appearance of sophistication over the act of understanding. He described Gerald Whitmore with a measured, factual precision that was more devastating than any emotional accounting would have been. When it was over, the investigator thanked him, and my father nodded, and then he did something I had never once seen him do in public. He put his face in his hands. Not sobbing. Just a moment of not holding it. Daniel put his hand briefly on my father's shoulder. My father looked up. Something passed between them, man to man, past every judgment that had been placed between them. Thank you, my father said. not to the investigator. "We're not done yet," Daniel said. "But we're close." What happened 3 hours later made close feel inadequate. Gerald Whitmore moved at 7 that evening. His lawyers filed a motion, a complex, aggressive document that challenged the standing of the documentation Daniel had submitted and named, specifically Daniel Osei as a party with compromised professional ethics. It was designed to inject enough legal ambiguity into the process to create a delay window. It was, from a purely technical standpoint, not unskillful. It was also, from a factual standpoint, built on sand. Because Daniel had known it was coming. 8 months of building a case had included, embedded within it, a specific preparation for exactly this move. He had structured the documentation chain to be challenge-resistant. Multiple independent custodians, time-stamped submissions, corroborating third-party witnesses for every material claim. The federal investigator had been briefed on the likelihood of a legal obstruction attempt and had already coordinated with the Department of Justice's Financial Crimes Division to ensure the submission was logged in a way that preempted jurisdictional arguments. The motion failed within 18 hours. A judge reviewed it and declined to grant the delay. I learned all of this the next morning over coffee that I couldn't drink because my hands were too unsteady. Daniel gave me the outline in the same patient, sequential way he gave me everything, and then he told me what happened next. At 9 a.m. that same morning, federal agents arrived at Gerald Whitmore's office building. He was not there. His assistant said he was traveling. His phone went unanswered. His lawyer issued a statement asserting full cooperation, while simultaneously saying nothing of substance. But the financial freeze on Harmon Properties accounts, which the investigation had quietly secured 2 days prior, in preparation for exactly this moment, meant that the assets he would have needed to liquidate and move were already inaccessible. The extraction he'd been preparing to execute was stopped mid-motion. It was not, I want to be clear, a clean or triumphant conclusion. Real situations of this kind are never clean. There were months of legal process ahead, complications and uncertainties, damage that had already been done and could only be partially repaired. My father's financial exposure would take years and significant effort to fully resolve. Some of the property owners who had been victimized by Harmon had already lost things they would not recover. But the machine had been stopped, and Reginald Alcott was not going to take the fall for it. I called Eloise that morning and told her what had happened. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked if she could come over. To our place. I said, yes. Of course. She arrived that afternoon with a bottle of wine she was clearly using as a social crutch, and the expression of someone who had spent several days confronting themselves and had arrived at conclusions she wasn't comfortable with but couldn't avoid. Daniel answered the door. Eloise looked at him. I watched her do the accounting, the rapid, visible internal process of reconciling the story she had told herself about this man with the evidence of the last 2 weeks. I owe you an apology, she said. Direct, no preamble. A large one. And I owe Vivian one too. Daniel stepped back and let her in. Come have some tea, he said. We can get to the apologies later. My sister looked at me over his shoulder. Something in her face broke open just slightly, the way a window opens, not the way a wall falls. He actually said that, she mouthed. I almost laughed. My parents came to dinner 3 weeks after the federal action. My mother had called ahead and asked if she could bring anything, which was so foreign to our dynamic that I answered incorrectly and said no before I realized I should have said yes just to let her feel useful. She came anyway with a dish she'd made, a layered potato thing, comfort food in the most literal sense, the kind of thing you make when you don't have words for everything you're feeling. She was in our kitchen before dinner setting up, and I came in to find her standing at the counter looking at it, really looking at it. Not at the exposed pipes or the reclaimed hardware. At the light, which Daniel had installed along the upper shelving in a warm amber that hit the brick walls perfectly at this hour of the evening. He built this himself, she asked. Most of it, yes. She ran her hand along the edge of one of the shelves. It's beautiful, she said. Simply. Without qualification. I didn't say anything. I went to the stove, and we stood there together in a silence that was, for the first time, genuinely comfortable. My father arrived with Eloise, who had become oddly inseparable from our parents over the past weeks in the way that crises sometimes compact families that have been letting distance accumulate. He walked into our apartment and this time looked at it differently, with the attention he'd been too defended to offer before. Daniel came out of his office where he'd been finishing a call. My father crossed the room and took his hand, but then, In a move that clearly cost him something, but which he paid freely, he pulled Daniel into an embrace. Brief, awkward, unmistakably real. "Reg," Daniel said, which was the first time he'd ever used my father's name that way. My father laughed, startled. "Don't push it," he said. But he was smiling. Dinner that evening was the longest meal our family had ever shared, and the most honest. Not all of it was easy. There were acknowledgments that came out rougher than intended, old grievances that surfaced briefly before being recognized and put back down. My mother asked Daniel carefully about his family in Accra, and he told her about his parents with an openness that was clearly not what she'd expected. His father, an engineer who had built roads in the Volta region. His mother, who ran a community literacy program and wrote letters by hand because she believed screens didn't carry enough weight for important things. My mother listened in a way I'd rarely seen her listen, without simultaneously formulating her response. She asked questions. Real ones. "She sounds extraordinary," she said. "She is," Daniel said. "I'd like you to meet her. When this is all somewhat less complicated." My mother looked at him for a moment. "I'd like that very much," she said. Eloise, who had been watching this exchange with the focused attention of someone taking notes for a later reckoning with herself, refilled everyone's glasses without being asked and said nothing at all, which for her was a form of profundity. After dinner, after my parents had gone and Eloise was putting on her coat, she stopped in the doorway and looked at both of us. "I need to say something," she said. "Not as an apology because I've already done that. Just as a fact." She looked at Daniel. "You could have told us about the investigation at any point. From the beginning. You could have used it to make a point." Daniel waited. "You didn't. You just handled it. And kept handling it." She paused. "I want you to know I understand the difference between someone who does the right thing to be seen doing it, and someone who does it because it's the right thing." Daniel nodded. "Thank you, Eloise." She kissed me on the cheek, something she hadn't done since we were children, and went out into the evening. I closed the door and stood in the hallway, listening to the quiet of our apartment after everyone had gone. Daniel was already in the kitchen, doing dishes, humming something under his breath. Amber light on brick. Shelves he'd built with his hands. I went and stood beside him. "My mother said it's beautiful," I told him. "What is?" "The kitchen. The shelves." He smiled, that delayed smile, the one that started deep and arrived late. "She has good taste," he said. "She does," I said. "She just had to get out of her own way to use it." He handed me a dish towel without looking up, and I stood beside him and dried, and outside the amber windows the city did its city things, and inside our home everything was quiet and repaired and real. But there was one thing left. One conversation that hadn't happened yet. One person who hadn't said what still needed to be said. And in the morning, without warning or announcement, that person rang our doorbell. My father was standing at our door at 7:45 in the morning. No coat, which meant he'd left in a hurry. No coffee, which meant he hadn't been home long before he'd decided to come. He was holding a single envelope, which he extended toward me the moment I opened the door. "I need to give this to Daniel," he said. I stepped back. "Come in." Daniel appeared from the hallway, still in yesterday's clothes, clearly already awake and working. He saw my father and stopped. My father walked to him. He held out the envelope. "I wrote it down because I'm better at things when I write them," he said, with the particular self-knowledge of a man who has recently learned some things about himself. "So it's a letter. Which is old-fashioned and I don't care." Daniel took the envelope. My father clasped his hands. He looked at the floor briefly, then back up. "I want to say it to your face as well," he said. "Not just in paper." He took a breath. "I treated you with contempt. Before I knew you. Before I ever made any effort to know you. I decided what you were based on what you weren't, based on a set of criteria that had nothing to do with who you actually are." He paused. "I want you to know I understand that, and I'm not asking you to forgive it on any particular schedule. I'm just asking you to know that I know." Daniel looked at him for a moment with those steady, patient eyes. Then he said, "I know you know. I've known for a little while." My father blinked. "You have. The day you called me after the clinic. The way you said it, 'Tell me what you need me to do.' There was something in it that wasn't just about the legal situation." My father was quiet. Then he made a small sound that might have been a laugh if it had traveled further. "You see a great deal. Vivian sees more," Daniel said. My father looked at me. Full look, the kind he almost never gave, because full looks required you to be fully present, and my father had spent most of his life partially somewhere else. "Yes," he said. "She does." We had coffee, the three of us, at our kitchen table. My father sat in the morning light and looked around our home with the careful, open attention of someone finally giving a place its proper consideration. He asked Daniel about the building they were constructing downtown, a community recreation center, partially funded through a grant Daniel had spent 8 months applying for. He asked questions that showed he'd been listening during the dinners, the document sessions, the hurried exchanges over weeks of crisis. He asked questions like someone who wanted to understand rather than someone who needed to be impressed. Daniel told him about the recreation center, about the design, the community consultations, the materials he'd sourced to keep costs down while maintaining quality. About the youth carpentry program he was considering starting there. About the idea, still embryonic, of partnering with legal aid clinics to offer workshops on property rights and financial literacy in communities that had been targeted by predatory schemes like Harmon's. My father listened. And as he listened, something settled across his face. The final resolution of a process that had been underway for weeks. Not peace exactly. Something working toward it. The wrong man, my father said after a long pause. Not a question. Daniel tilted his head. That's what we thought, my father said. My wife, Eloise. I won't speak for them specifically, but I will speak for myself. He set his mug down. I thought Vivian had made the wrong choice. I thought you were insufficient for her. He shook his head slowly. I am not a man who admits he is wrong about things. I have structured my entire life to avoid situations where I have to admit it. So I want you to understand what it costs me to say this clearly. He looked at Daniel. You are the best decision my daughter ever made. And the fact that you spent 8 months protecting people who were dismissing you, who were being unkind to you, in my case and in Eloise's, without ever using it as leverage, without waiting to see what you could get out of us, that is a quality I do not see in most men. In any men. Daniel was quiet. I am proud, my father said carefully, to call you my son-in-law. The word landed in the room the way certain words do, gently and with enormous weight. Daniel said nothing for a moment. Then, thank you, Reginald. My father nodded. He picked up his coffee. He looked out the window. A man allowing himself, quietly, to feel something he'd earned. Later that day, much later, after my father had gone and the apartment had settled back into its rhythms, Daniel came and found me in the sitting room where I was reading. He sat beside me without a word, and I put down my book without a word, and for a while we just sat together in the light of the afternoon. What are you thinking about? He asked eventually. I thought about it honestly. About how different everything looks from the other side, I said. When I was growing up, the story my family told about success was all about surface. The right address, the right associations, the right amount of money visible in the right ways. I paused. I could never live in that story. It always felt like wearing someone else's clothing. So you married a construction worker, he said, a note of mild amusement. I married a man who promised an elderly stranger, with no audience and nothing to gain, that he was going to fix things. I looked at him. I knew exactly what I was doing. He put his arm around me. I know you did, he said. Outside, the city continued its accumulation of ordinary days. Somewhere across town, my parents were sitting in a home they still owned, navigating a future that was uncertain but no longer catastrophic. My sister was in her office, reconstructing her own relationship with the idea of integrity. A community recreation center was being built 12 blocks away, taking shape steel beam by steel beam in the hands of people who built things to last. Some stories end in grand revelation. A single moment where everything clicks into resolution and every character receives their precise accounting. This one didn't. It ended in something quieter and harder to locate. The incremental, imperfect process of people choosing to see each other more honestly. My family thought I married the wrong man. They thought he was too plain, too practical, too unglamorous. They thought he didn't understand the performance required of people trying to be more than they were. They thought he was insufficient. What they had missed, what was always true and simply needed circumstances large enough to reveal it, was this. Daniel Osei had never needed to perform anything because he had spent his entire life building actual things. Real things. The kind that hold weight. The kind that stand up when tested. A legal aid clinic on a Saturday morning. A promise made to a stranger with no audience. We're going to fix this. He always meant it. And in the end he did.